And when I finally quit, I quit to my promoting owner, and I approached him. I was like, I heard you say this. He's like, I never said that. And I said, no, I remember like quite clearly the words that you said and how you said them. He's like, oh, well, maybe you overheard something that was in a different context. And that's when it clicked that I was like being gaslighted the entire time I was in that company. I was in the company for like 9 months. Well, split for 2 because I promoted out. But I was just like, that's when I realized I was being manipulated. And it took me a couple months, and I'm like finally coming out of it, like what was real and what they told me just because they knew I had to hear it.
Ashley, you were a sales rep for a Cydcor office out of Houston, Texas, originally, and then you had a couple positions altogether. But first, as a sales rep, what attracted you to this position originally?
So what happened was I was a manager at a restaurant, which is what I got my major in school. And when that kind of went sideways, I was like, maybe I'll take a break from food and bev. And I just want to try something like completely new altogether. So over Christmas break, I remember applying to like 40, 45 jobs, just like get me out of here. And I got a call one day, and of course, like I'd applied to so many jobs, I couldn't remember who was calling me. And they're like, hey, like I hear you're looking for a job, and I really like your resume. I like how you had hospitality experience. That's what we really look for, because you're able to talk to people. And they didn't really tell me like what the job was. I just know that it was like an office job. That's the impression I got. And so I was like, yeah, sure, I'll come in for an interview. And I think I went in for an interview the next day. And that's when I spoke to the owner. And he was cool. Like I thought he was really professional, and I liked that he was young and successful. And so whenever he told me like a little bit about the job, I was like still kind of hesitant on what it was. But I came back for a second interview. And before I even came back for that second interview, I kind of knew like I had it in the bag. Just kind of like you get that feeling that you're going to get something. And so the person who interviewed me for my second was my leader, who ended up becoming my leader. And I remember he went over the pitch, and I was like, this is so easy. I could totally do this. Like it's scripted. I don't have to like make up anything. And I made sure to ask, like, do I have to do this to like family and friends? They're like, no, we provide all the leads for you. And so, yeah, that's kind of what got me into it. I was just like, this is really easy. And people like, things normally come easily to me. I don't really have to learn or study a lot. So I was like, this is going to be like cool.
It's interesting that you went through the first interview, still didn't really know what the job was, which is a very common theme among almost everyone that I talk to. And I'll throw myself into that too, because I was in the same boat. So what drew you back for the second interview, even though you didn't really know what the job was? Was it primarily because you knew that you were in good with the president and that you were part of this toxic environment previously?
Yeah, so I knew how to like recognize toxic environments, at least from my own experiences, like watch how the employees talk about others like when they're not there and all that stuff. And I remember there was a glass window in the room that we were interviewing in, and the office was really nice. It wasn't like one of those crappy offices in a weird like park. And through that glass window, I could see people like playing games and being energetic. And that's really what drew me to it, because I wanted that like a great culture. And I was like, well, they're over there playing games and everybody's pretty much my age. Like I can make some friends out of this too. It wasn't like I wanted a career out of it or anything. It was more so just I wanted to meet new people, and it seemed like a really good place to do it.
All right. Well, I'm sure we'll address toxic environments again before this video is over. I have a feeling that we'll get there eventually. But as a sales rep, number one, what were you selling? And then in your message to us, you said that it really didn't take long for you to start getting burnt out. I know you just said that you first thought it was going to be easy and everything, but apparently that didn't last. So what were you selling and what were you experiencing that caused you to get burnt out so quick?
So we were on an office supply campaign, which is under like one of those big name retail stores. It wasn't the name of the retail store, but apparently they owned this office supply company. And so we weren't going door to door. Like they made sure that we did not feel that way. We were going business to business, which is the same thing. It's just
Same
not a
thing.
residential. Yeah. And so we went out, and I remember going with my leader, and my leader, like watching a lot of your videos, I noticed a lot of people say that like employees live together. It's not a very like money-making business, but my campaign or my office was the #1. And so people were making money. Like I could see it. I could see like brand names and stuff like that. So I was like, this has to be legit.
Yeah.
But I went out with him, and he was just like getting sale after sale. And I was like, oh my Lord, how is this guy doing this? And then I started doing it. And my first couple of weeks, of course, I didn't make a lot. But there was like 1 week that I made like $1,000, and I was like, whoa, that was cool. And then I went back down. It was just kind of like a one-time thing, but I realized that maybe I could stay in this. And so then looking back, like at the hours that I was working, I was getting to the office at like 6:45, 7, because I wanted to be like the #1 like newbie. I wanted to be there before everybody else. And then we would leave the field at 5. So I was working like 60 hours a week. And then on the weekends, we would have calls. And then after work, twice a week, we would have crew night, which was with like my team and the guy who hired me and everybody he'd hired. And then we'd have team night, which is a whole office. That was twice a week. And if you didn't go to those, you were like kind of looked down upon. And so just working 60 hours and then doing that, I was just getting so tired, and driving around all the time and spending money on gas. It just wasn't what I was expecting it to be.
And now, eventually, you helped open a new office. You started in Houston. You then helped open this new office in Dallas. And the title that you said you had was Head of Talent Development, which sounds pretty fancy. And I think for a normal business, an actual opportunity, that would probably be a good opportunity for someone just based on the title. But what were your responsibilities in this context?
So I was supposed to call like 100 to 120 people a day, book 20 to 30 people for interviews each day. And then I was kind of like the personal assistant in a way for the owner. When I was on these recruiter calls, they were like, make sure that you are never a source of like stress for your owner. You are the one that's supposed to take the stress off of them. And I was like, okay, I get that. Like I see what my previous owner's done. He does a lot. And so I was cool with that. But it was just like, I was calling these people and people weren't answering, which is, I mean, a thing that happens when you call a lot of people, or I was getting like questions that I didn't know how to answer without completely turning them off of the job. And so that's when I started to notice like kind of weird things that were going on. And I would ask my coach about them. She's like, oh yeah, you just got to answer it this way. So that way they don't ask about it again. But it was a lot of calls and a lot of Zoom. That's what we did because it was during COVID.
Right. So as the admin / recruiter, which is basically what you were, one of the things you said to us was, and this is your words, quote, I was told not to lie, but to omit truths from my phone calls, which I think many people watching this would probably think, well, omitting the truth could technically be a lie, depending on what you're talking about. And you kind of mentioned this just now about how your coach, your recruiter, whatever, gave you specific answers to try to get people to not question you. So what were some of the things you were told to omit, and some of the things that you were told to like really emphasize to get people into the door?
We were really told to emphasize the salary, which is not a salary, it's commission. And so people would say like, well, what's the salary? Because it's COVID and they need to know if they can support themselves. I'd say, oh, it's like 40 to 50, but I've seen some people make 80 to 90, which is what our top rep did. But the truth is, when I was, just your average salesperson, I was probably not even making like 35. And so I was supposed to go off of like the average of our top reps, and being such a new office, of course, you're going to bring the people from your old office that are doing the best. So it ups those numbers. And then when people would say like, is this cold calling? In my head, like I Googled cold calling whenever they'd ask, and it described exactly what we did. And my coach, she was like, no, it's not cold calling. What do you do? And I was describing to her what we do. She goes, okay, so how would you describe that? I'm like, cold calling. She's like, no, what we do is warm calling. We make appointments with people. We make appointments with people, and then we go back, and I'm like, but how do you make those appointments with people? You have to like walk in for that first time, which is cold calling, and I never asked you for assistance or anything. And so anytime people call, like I was calling people and interviewing them over the phone, if they asked, I would say yes, because I'm like, I'm not going to lie about the most basic function of this job.
Yeah.
Like you're either in it or you're out of it, because some people love cold calling and much rather you know the truth getting into it. But it was stuff like that. And I asked several people, and her previous owner, who's also her boyfriend, he said it was cold calling, but she said it wasn't. And I was just getting a lot of input from a lot of people, and none of it was the same.
Yeah. I mean, you're gonna frame things in a specific way to try to get as many people in the door as possible. And it's interesting. I feel like a lot of these people probably have a good future in politics if they want to go that route, because the way they frame things is just to deceive people. And you just brought up this idea of relationships. And if anyone who's seen previous videos knows that relationships in this Cydcor cult is nothing new. It happens. It's probably more common than it isn't. And you actually shared with us that you were involved with somebody, which, like you said, is not allowed, but you went on in your message to say that your promoting owner, one of his outside deals, and several other owners were all in relationships with their recruiters, and it seemed to be all right. So I'm kind of curious, the relationship you were in was made known, and there was kind of a different reaction to that than these relationships that these other people were in, right?
Yeah, so I got in the relationship before I was even a recruiter. So I'm in Texas. I go home to the East Coast because like we're working from home. I don't have to be at my apartment. I can be with my family. And there was another office like in our pyramid, I guess.
Pyramid, pretty much, yeah.
Yeah, there was another office under that that was also on the East Coast, but in a different state. And so over Zoom, like we're all talking, and it's like 60 of us just all under this one guy, and he's kind of giving us like lectures and stuff. And I meet this guy, and we start texting. And so we meet up, and we go on a couple of dates, and then it kind of like starts to turn serious, but not officially yet. And then I moved back home, and it kind of ends. And I'm like, well, what happened? And so I was talking to my mom about it, and I was like, I need to talk to somebody that knows this person, so maybe they can give me some input. So I go to one of who I thought was like one of my best friends in the company that I was in. And I learned that she had like screenshotted texts that we had sent and sent it to my boss and his boss, saying like, this is what this guy's doing. Like, she didn't put any blame on me, but because she was my friend, and it was weird like that. But I learned later that he had gotten like a call from my owner's owner, who's like the top of the pyramid, just saying like, if you don't stop this, you're gonna get fired. And I remember like I couldn't talk to him, or else I was like afraid he was gonna get fired for talking to me. But then when I started training to become a recruiter, my coach, who was a recruiter, dated and lived with my boss. And then his outside deal, he had previously dated before he dated his recruiter. And then it was hard to find somebody that I could get advice from that didn't date their owner, because I was not about to date my owner. So I was like, I need advice from people that aren't in that personal relationship with them, how to handle things. And it was harder to find that than it was the other way around. So I was just kind of like twisted in my mind how things worked. I was just like, how is this okay for them, but not for me?
Yeah, and it was out in the open, right? It wasn't like anything that was hidden. You know, these people were kind of openly involved in these relationships.
Oh yeah. So they were open. Me and this guy, we were kind of keeping it on the down low, but of course we were going to tell people later because it wasn't serious. But yeah, everybody else was like, everybody knew.
Yeah, I'm really curious how they justify that, because it sounds incredibly hypocritical when there's supposedly this no dating, no hooking up rule, but you know, there are so many like you said, it would be hard. I think it's easier to find people that are involved instead of those that aren't.
Yeah.
Because it's everywhere. It's ubiquitous throughout Cydcor, Smart Circle, Credico, Appco, all these different companies. Owners are dating or living with, or even eventually get married to their recruiters, their admins, which kind of further emphasizes that these companies are cults, because that's what happens. Those insulated relationships happen within these cult mindsets.
Yeah.
Even though, like, people like sales reps, team leaders, kind of newer admins, newer recruiters are told, no, this shouldn't happen, and you're going to get fired if this does happen.
Yeah. What really got me was the fact that he was going to get fired apparently if he like didn't really perform, and if he talked to me. That all went down, but I was never spoken to and he was never spoken to. It was all through like screenshots and like rumors. They never talked to any of us.
Yeah, that's common too, I think. I mean, I know every owner's different. Some owners will kind of approach conflict in certain situations head on, but I think the at least the ones I've researched and the ones I know about, the vast majority of them are more passive in terms of how they deal with conflict, especially things like this, where they'll do it behind people's backs, or like if they want to fire somebody, they'll just leave them off the schedule or not send them a schedule instead of actually having those tough conversations. It's an easy out. It's a conversation that they feel like they don't have to have, unfortunately. All right. So as time went on, you were doing this recruiting thing, but things weren't going well, and you told us, quote, that you were struggling with just the decision of quitting. You even shared with us that you would cry every day about how you felt you didn't have control in your life, which is usually not a healthy trait for when you're employed by somebody, right? You want to feel some semblance of control in your life. What did you feel that you didn't have control over?
I felt like I didn't have any job security. Like if they say that, oh, you're this person that we chose, like we handpicked to be this guy's recruiter. So I'm like, oh wow, that means I like must have some special quality that they want. But I started to learn that like you're very replaceable, because I'd be in group chats with recruiters, and there would be people that would join, and then like a couple weeks later they just leave the group. And I'm like, if it's so hard to replace somebody, like how are these people quitting and you're okay with it? And they don't even like bat an eye. Like I actually worked for a couple offices outside of my own because they didn't have recruiters. And I was just like, it's just wrong. And then I think the thing that really just like ticked me off and was kind of the tipping point was I went to my owner's father-in-law's lake house for Labor Day. And I went with a couple of our top sellers, not all of them though. And we were just kind of hanging out, having a good time. But of course, there's going to be a Zoom call on Saturday morning because there's always like a 2 to 3 hour one. And I didn't have to be on it because I was a recruiter, but I was just sitting outside. And then as my boss, I was like, is it okay if I listen to this? Like, am I allowed to be here? And he was like, no, yeah, you've heard everything we're going to talk about. And right as I'm going inside, I hear my previous owner, who is my boss's promoting owner now, talk about how I threw a tantrum the other day to my coach. And I was just like thinking back, like, when did I throw a tantrum? Like, I know I cry a lot. I'm an emotional person, but I don't remember doing that. And I looked back and I approached my coach about an issue I was having with my top salesperson. I was like, everybody I send them, they just reject. And I'm like, these are quality people. Like, what's happening? She had gone through the exact same thing with that same person. So I was like, this is the perfect conversation to have. And so I'm crying because I'm frustrated. And she's just like, it's okay. Like, what can I help you do? And I'm just like, no, it's me. I need to work on my numbers. And I'm just like putting all the blame on myself. And I think that's the tantrum that she was talking about. And I'm like, if me going to my coach and discussing like legitimate problems about how I have to do my job is a tantrum, like it's not worth it. And when I finally quit, I quit to my promoting owner, and I approached him. I was like, I heard you say this. He's like, I never said that. And I said, no, I remember like quite clearly the words that you said and how you said them. And he's like, oh, well, maybe you overheard something that was in a different context. And that's when it clicked that I was like being gaslighted the entire time I was in that company. I was in the company for like 9 months. Well, split for 2. because I promoted out. But I was just like, that's when I realized I was being manipulated. And it took me a couple months, and I'm like finally coming out of it, like what was real and what they told me just because they knew I had to hear it. It's just, I remember when I was home too for COVID, I told my dad, like, I feel like I'm being brainwashed, but in a good way, in a good way. And I tell my dad that now, and he's like, yeah, I knew you were in for something, but I was going to let you live your life, make your own decisions. And I'm like, I wish you'd told me, because I noticed it, and that's the worst part. And so I just want to like make sure other people don't go through that too.
Sure. Now, do you think, or at what point do you think you would that feedback from other people would have had an effect on you? Because I've talked to many people who said, even people who've family and close friends who've said, this is something sinister, this is something you need to get out of, and I didn't listen to them. So do you really think that feedback would have helped you in some way?
Maybe later on when I was starting to have doubts, but I remember like discovering like the Double Core Reddit page, and I was going to this is in like March, like 3 months in, and I was going to my coworkers like, have you seen this? This is ridiculous. Like, a lot of it's true, but they're twisting the words. And I remember just being like, I have to be right, because if I'm not right, that means that I've gotten myself into something that I don't want to be in. Yeah. And so I started watching your videos and looking at Reddit pages and stuff right before I even started having doubts, and it didn't faze me at all.
So the doubts you started having, that was from your own accord. That wasn't because of anything else, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. I feel like that's a common thread too, that in order for people to take that first step of getting out, they have to, a crack has to form in their own facade, and it can't be caused by any external factors.
It has to be like an original thought.
Yeah. Yeah. And you had talked a little bit about the previous industry that you had worked for, and talking about it in our messages about being a toxic environment. Would you describe this as a toxic environment?
I would say so, but not as bad as it was before, because in the beginning it was so good. Like, I was having friends like on my left and on my right. We were always going out. We were always like having dinners at each other's house. That part wasn't toxic, because when I look back, that was like true friendship. But when you start having doubts, that's when you start to become isolated and people stop talking to you. Yeah. Because you can't express those doubts. Like, the first time I did that to one of my coworkers was after I quit. I was like, have you ever noticed that they do this a certain way and they tell you not to say things? And I never heard from her again.
I was going to ask you, all these friends you made, did any of those friendships last after you left?
No.
Yeah.
No, and that sucks, because we were good friends, but it's just about the job. If you're not in it, then you're not a part of their like circle.
Yep. You had mentioned earlier about the money that you weren't making. You actually ended up having to take another job on the weekends because you weren't making enough money, and you ended up making more. Again, you're not the first person to tell me this. You ended up making more from your weekend job just on the weekends than you did an entire week in Cydcor. Yeah. So I'm curious, how did you justify that, and how long after you got that other job did you end up leaving?
Well, the reason that I even was able to stay through COVID, my office said they weren't going to lay anyone off because we're the #1 office. Like, you see the numbers, there's no way we can afford it. And then we go over everybody's break evens individually with our owner, and mine was apparently low enough that he could afford to keep me. Next thing I know, 10 out of 20 people are being laid off and no longer employed by us. And so I was like, okay, that's weird. So I told him my break even's like 600, for example. I get 600, but then they have to tax it. So now I'm in like a $400 deficit for the month. Yeah. So I'm like, I have to start doing something else. Like, it's not a new thing for me to pick up another job just because I get bored. And so I picked up a weekend job doing what I did before in food and bev. And like, just through tips alone, I was making up that $400 deficit each weekend.
Yeah.
And so I think I was in that job for 2 weeks, and then I was like, I can do this full time. I'm quitting.
Yeah, and I think that's a major hole that people are kind of usually brainwashed out of when they get into these companies. Because I understand that nobody wants to be a professional like waiter, waitress, or server like for their lives, right? Most people have more ambitions for that, but
Mhm.
that can be a really good stepping stone to real career opportunities and making
Mhm.
a little bit decent money, right? Like you said, I mean, granted, you should all be paid a living wage. That's never going to happen in this country, but you make decent money off tips, at least rightfully. You should be, right?
Yeah.
So, and you can make a really good amount of money on tips alone from waiter, waitressing, from bartending. And they, of course, will say, oh, that's not a real opportunity, that you will never make as much money there as you will here. Whereas I've talked to dozens of people who worked in Cydcor and Credico who say, oh yeah, my one paycheck was $30, or I made
Mhm.
$200 a month working for this. But you're supposed to realize, you're supposed to think, oh, I'm not going to make any money now. This is just a stepping stone to a greater opportunity.
Mhm.
Number one, that's a lie. And number two, you have to have some type of living wage. You can't live off
Yeah.
of $300 a month. That's ridiculous to even think anyone could do that. But
Mhm.
you're supposed to think that when you're trapped in this cult.
Yeah. I
Um,
didn't I didn't tell my boss or anything that I got the weekend job, because I was
yeah,
like, if they hear that, they're gonna start questioning my loyalty.
yeah, yeah,
Like
and
to
you probably would have been fired too, because
yeah.
they would have thought, well, you're not giving that 110% here. You feel like
Mhm.
you have to do this other thing, and you can't do both things because you're
Yeah.
not dedicating everything to this opportunity.
Yeah.
Um, when you first contacted us, you said that you wanted to be a part of this extra take series, to use your words, as long as I can put something out there that protects others from being in my situation.
Mhm.
So since now you've shared your story, what is it that you want people to take away from this? And how do you think other people can protect themselves from getting trapped inside these cults?
I think if you hear the keywords like preliminary, promoting owner, first, second, third, fourth, anything like that interview, and then you come into an office that like everybody's super young, that should be a red flag. Because that was another thing I started noticing as a recruiter. I would find these people and they've got awesome resumes and I think they'd be perfect, but they're 40. And my boss would say, oh, they're overqualified. We're looking for people that graduated high school after like 2010.
Yeah.
And I'm like, oh. So if you find something like that where nobody's over the age of like 30, 35, I feel like that should be a red flag. And that's something I didn't notice before. I did mention before that my office was different, like people actually made money.
Yeah.
So that was one thing that if I had been watching your videos and noticed that people were living together, I would have thought to myself, this is what I've gotten myself into. But these people wearing brand names, going out, buying like 150 bottle wine for a dinner, stuff like that. Our trips were always being paid for. I never had to drop a dime except for gas. I was like, this is a pretty good deal. So that just shows that you don't have to be not making a lot of money for it to be one of those companies. Like they can be successful if they have the right person leading them to manipulate other people. So
Mhm.
yeah.
And it's always hard to determine how many of these people actually are making money that they can afford the brand names versus
Mm-hmm.
just the impression management, right? Like it
Yeah.
seems like they're making money, but they might have gotten that brand name on closeout at TJ Maxx, or maybe they
Mm-hmm.
have a parent who set up a trust fund for them or is supplementing their income or paying for their apartment or
Mm-hmm.
something like that, right? It's difficult to figure that out, because in order to figure that out, you either A, have to pay incredibly close attention to them, probably like every single moment of every single day.
Mm-hmm.
B, you have to ask these questions to them. But then there's also B1, which they may lie to you, right? Like they might
Yeah.
be getting all these things second and third hand, but they don't have to tell you that, right? They could
Mm-hmm.
say, oh, I just laid down $500 for this watch, when in fact, oh, it was a gift.
Yeah.
So it's almost impossible to know that.
Yeah.